Hi there, and welcome back to the introduction of Scrum. In our learning so far of the framework of the SBOT Guide, we have already learned about how to use the SBOT Guide, Scrum principles, and Scrum aspects in the previous modules. Now let's take a closer look at the processes and how they work. You probably remember hearing that a project has a product backlog of prioritized requirements, as well as a product owner who is responsible for prioritizing these requirements. Now the question is, how do you get this work done? First of all, let's define the Scrum processes in general. Scrum processes address the specific activities and flow of a Scrum project. In total, there are 19 processes, which are grouped into 5 phases. These phases are presented in chapters 8 through 12 of the SBOT Guide. These 5 phases describe each process in detail, including the associated inputs, tools, and outputs. Also, in each process, some inputs, tools, and outputs are designated as mandatory, while others are designated as optional. The decision to include any optional input, tool, and/or output depends on the particular project, organization, or industry. Inputs and outputs denoted as mandatory are important for the successful implementation of Scrum in any organization. Next, we'll take a closer look at the phases and the processes enlisted under them. Initiate is the first phase, and the processes carried out as part of Initiate are as follows. Create project vision is the first process performed. In this process, the project business case is reviewed to create a project vision statement that will serve as the inspiration and provide focus for the entire project. The product owner is identified in this process. Identify Scrum Master and stakeholders is the second process, during which the Scrum Master is identified using specific selection criteria. Form Scrum Team is the third process in the Initiate phase. In this process, Scrum team members are identified. Normally, the product owner has the primary responsibility of selecting team members, but he or she often chooses the team in collaboration with the Scrum Master. The fourth process is Develop Epics. In this process, the project vision statement serves as the basis for developing epics, which are large, unrefined user stories. User group meetings may be held to develop epics. Create a prioritized product backlog is the next process. In this process, epics and unrefined user stories are refined and elaborated, then prioritized to create a prioritized product backlog for the project. The done criteria is also established at this point. The last process classified under the Initiate phase is Conduct Release Planning. In this process, the Scrum core team reviews the user stories in the prioritized product backlog to develop a release planning schedule, which is essentially a phased deployment schedule that can be shared with the project stakeholders. The second phase we're going to learn is Plan and Estimate, and these are processes grouped under this phase. First is Create User Stories. We can see that in this process, user stories and their related user story acceptance criteria are created. User stories are usually written by the product owner and are designed to ensure that the customer's requirements are clearly depicted and can be fully understood by all the stakeholders. User story writing exercises may be held. This involves Scrum team members creating the user stories. User stories are incorporated into the prioritized product backlog. Approve, estimate, and commit user stories is the next process. In this process, the product owner approves user stories for a sprint. Then, the Scrum Master and Scrum team estimate the effort required to develop the functionality described in each user story. And the Scrum team commits to develop the customer requirements in the form of approved, estimated, and committed user stories. The third process in the Plan and Estimate phase is Create Tasks. In this process, the approved, estimated, and user stories are broken down into specific tasks and compiled into a task list. Often, a task planning meeting is held for this purpose. Estimate tasks is the fourth process. During this process, The Scrum core team, in a task estimation workshop, estimates the effort required to accomplish each item in the task list. The result of this process is an effort-estimated task list. The last process conducted during this phase is Create Sprint Backlog. In this process, the Scrum core team holds sprint planning meetings, where the group creates a sprint backlog containing all tasks to be completed in the sprint. The third phase we'll discuss in this module is Implement. Let's now look at the various processes listed to be carried out during this phase. The first process in the Implement phase is Create Deliverables. In this process, the Scrum team works on the tasks in the sprint backlog to create sprint deliverables. A Scrum board is often used to track the work and activities being carried out. Issues or problems being faced by the Scrum team could be updated in an impediment log. The second process performed is Conduct Daily Stand-Up. Every day, a highly focused, time-boxed meeting is conducted, which is called the Daily Stand-Up meeting. This is the forum for the Scrum team to update each other on their progress and any impediments they may be facing. The last process conducted during the Implement phase is Scrum Prioritized Product Backlog. In this process, the prioritized product backlog is continuously updated and maintained. A prioritized product backlog review meeting may be held, in which any changes or updates to the backlog are discussed and incorporated into the prioritized product backlog as appropriate. The next phase is Review and Retrospect. There are three main processes that take place during this phase. The first one is Convene Scrum of Scrums. In this process, Scrum team representatives convene for Scrum of Scrums meetings in predetermined intervals, or whenever required, to collaborate and track their respective progress, impediments, and dependencies across teams. This is relevant only for large projects where multiple Scrum teams are involved. The second process is Demonstrate and Validate Sprint. In this process, the Scrum team demonstrates the sprint deliverables to the product owner and to the relevant stakeholders in a sprint review meeting. The purpose of this meeting is to secure approval and acceptance of the product or service by the product owner. The last process performed in the Review and Retrospect phase is Retrospect Sprint. In this process, the Scrum Master and Scrum team meet to discuss the lessons learned throughout the sprint. This information is documented as lessons learned, which can be applied to future sprints. Often, as a result of this discussion, there may be agreed actionable improvements or updated Scrum Guidance Body recommendations. The last phase is Release. There are two main processes performed during this phase. The first one is Ship Deliverables. In this process, accepted deliverables are delivered or transmitted to the relevant stakeholders. A formal working deliverables agreement documents the successful completion of the sprint. The second process is Retrospect Project. In this process, which completes the project, organizational stakeholders and Scrum core team members assemble to retrospect the project and identify, document, and internalize the lessons learned. Often, these lessons lead to documentation of agreed actionable improvements to be implemented in future projects. This brings us to the end of the segment on the Scrum processes. Before we wind up, let's recap the various phases and processes we learned. Here is the summary of all Scrum processes. I hope you have enjoyed learning with us today. We look forward to seeing you in our next segment, Scrum versus Traditional Project Management. Thank you for learning with us.